Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this is the podcast where we interview authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. Today, we'll be talking to Beth Brust. She's a co-author of the book Quirky, Yes, Hopeless, No, Practical Tips to Help Your Child with Asperger Syndrome Be More Socially Accepted. Before I introduce Beth, I want to thank you for being a listener. And this week, we'd like to encourage you to invite your friends to join our email list. It's easy to do. Just go to our website, nonfictionforlife.com, and you'll find a button there. And that's where your friends can click and join our email list, and they'll get the latest podcasts and blogs that we post. And now let me tell you about Beth Brust. She went to Stanford but missed the opportunity to have Scott Turow give her writing tips. He was a TA in one of the classes she took. She really didn't start writing until after she left Stanford. And so far, she's published 13 children's books, as well as numerous articles, profiles, and poems that have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the San Diego Union, Cricket, Spider, the Horn Book, Highlights for Children, Ranger Rick, and other magazines and newspapers. She's written these children's books, and one of them includes a biography about the lesser artistic side of the famous Danish author Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Little Mermaid and so forth. But today we're going to talk about something that is a little more personal to Beth. She's the mother of an Asperger's child, and this is how she got involved in writing the book Quirky, Yes, Hopeless, No. The book is reader-friendly, and it's aimed at parents and teachers who need help working with students who are just a little quirky. Whether this topic hits close to home or is just something that will help us be more sensitive to those people around us, we can all learn something from the book Quirky, Yes, Hopeless, No. We're delighted to have Beth join us today. Welcome to the program, Beth.
Thank you.
We appreciate you spending time today. This is a topic that I hope will be of interest to a lot of people. Before we get into Asperger's, though, I think it's important to note that you co-wrote this book with Dr. Norall. What was your relationship with her, and how did the two of you come to write such a book?
Well, Dr. Norall, it was in San Diego, where we live, and my son, Ben, was diagnosed with Asperger's in 4th grade. And so she had just started the year before something called the Friends Club, where she, as a cognitive behavior therapist who was fascinated with autism and kids on the spectrum, she decided that she would form a group, a social group, a place where they could learn social skills, which is what they lack. They're just not wired with people skills. And so she knew that she could teach them using various techniques, and it was called the Friends Club, where it was also revolutionary at the time because it was thought that Asperger's kids needed to be around neurotypical kids in order to find out how to properly behave or how to pick up the social skills that they'd lack. And instead, she groups kids, boys and girls of different ages, 11-year-olds and 4-year-olds and whatever, and had them meet once a week with one leader, and they would go through various exercises and activities and things that were sort of, looked fun, but they were actually teaching them how to be better team players, sportsmanship, how to make a conversation be two-way instead of just the child with Asperger's just delivering information straight on. So through the Friends Club, Ben got in that, and it was great, and he was improving at school, being able to relate to other kids. And she kept being told that she should write a book about this. She should, be able to share this with others. And so she tried. She wrote a book, a draft of it, but she got stuck, and she didn't know what to do, and she knew it wasn't quite right. So I offered to look at it for her, evaluate it. I'd give her my opinion as a published author. And she liked what I said so much that she hired me, actually, to write it because she thought she was going to self-publish it. But the more we got into the project, the more I said, we have to go to a regular publisher. We need regular distribution and sales routes because it will get more mainstream that way. And I thought it would be important to be able to get that information out there. And she was much too busy doing what she does with with the Friends Club and with CASE, which was her Comprehensive Autism Services and Education organization that she ran, she wouldn't be able to sell the book and distribute it and all the other things people don't realize take a lot of time once you actually have a book. So that's what happened, is that we then co-authored it together, and it's the only book out there that on autism, especially Asperger's, that has the expert's point of view, which I call is the breadth of it, where she's diagnosed and treated thousands of people, so she has that wide knowledge. And then there's the depth of the point of view of me as the parent, which is a 24/7 sort of appreciation for, living with the child who's on the spectrum, who has Asperger's. And many readers have commented on that. And our whole goal was to have it be very practical, very available to anyone, meaning the language, the vocabulary. There's no clinic speak. We tried to make it as accessible as possible, and people have appreciated that because it's meant for parents, grandparents, teachers, aides in schools, coaches, counselors at schools. I've given it to them before too. School psychologists, of course. That was our aim, and that's where we succeeded, actually.
I'm really glad you brought up the word autism, because I think that is a word people are a little more familiar with than Asperger's, and you're using words like on the spectrum and so forth. So I think before we get into the book itself, maybe you can make any distinctions between autism and Asperger's syndrome that we should understand.
Well, if anyone watched The Big Bang Theory, which was huge in being able to broadcast what a group of people who are on the spectrum are like, it's Sheldon and Leonard and their buddies, that Raj and the rest. It's so important. It as Tony Attwood said, there are 100 pieces. Tony Attwood is an Australian expert on autism and Asperger's in particular, and autism, as he said, has 100 pieces to the puzzle, and one person will have 20 pieces, another has 40, someone else has 60 pieces, and they may be different pieces even, and yet you can still tell that they're on the spectrum. There's just something about it. And that's why up front, in fact, I insisted that we have a list. When this book came out in 2009, I was still having to explain what Asperger's and even autism were to people. And we put right up front, what are the signs of Asperger's syndrome? Because there are these certain quirks, these are these certain tendencies, and so it helps you to identify up front to know, okay, it just makes it easier to explain. For instance, the difficulty in making eye contact, or the incredible interest in something in particular, almost to an obsession of either trains or planes or science or physics, as they do in the Big Bang Theory, and just the out of the box thinking, that they're quirky because they're unconventional. And they're hardwired that way. It's not like they're trying to be fresh and creative and original. They're born fresh and creative the way the rest of us are told we should be more of. And so Temple Grandin has a funny thing where she says she's convinced that we'd all still be sitting in caves talking to each other and chit-chatting because neurotypicals want to just be social, and that people stuff counts more to them, and it's the people on the spectrum with autism or Asperger's who have pushed us out of the cave, and come up with all sorts of huge leaps for civilization and mankind. And so that's where the importance is in it. But unfortunately, because they lack the people skills, kids with Asperger's, so they're at the higher end of the spectrum, is what it's considered. There's when we say the spectrum, it's everyone from the nonverbal to the Asperger's, where they're quite verbal and can go to college and are very intelligent and can communicate just fine, and yet there are these quirks. And it's a social disability, is what it truly is, where they just don't read faces. People's faces, they don't even look at faces often because, again, it's the eye contact thing. They get distracted by faces. So many people with Asperger's have to look away in order to collect their thoughts and be able to express themselves. They get too distracted, or it's even painful to look at a face. And then it's also social. They miss the social signals, of course, by not looking, at the person. And it's a communication disability in that they are truth tellers, and so they can be quite blunt. and say the wrong things to the wrong people at the wrong time and don't even know it. They just figure they're telling the truth. Or sometimes someone asks them something or talks to them and they don't even talk or they don't address them. And so they're often misinterpreted. Well, it's perceived as rude by other people, but they're just kind of lost in their own thoughts sometimes because they're, again, people on the spectrum are more driven by facts and concrete things than feelings. And so that's what can make things difficult then when they get into a social setting.
So, but to be clear for our listeners, it sounds like anyone who is dealing with someone who has autism can really benefit from the book. The Asperger's kids are the ones who are higher functioning, and is that correct so far?
Well, so Cynthia's specialty, Dr. Norall's specialty, was working with kids on the spectrum who have Asperger's syndrome, in that they probably have no friends at school because they don't understand how to make friends. And so, again, her goal was to help them learn just the basic, simplest of things that could help them just get one friend at school and not be bullied. So just greeting other people, saying hi back when someone says hi to you. Often kids don't think that's necessary. Aspies don't think that's necessary because the person can see they're there, so why do you need to say hi? You both know you're in the same room. It's just cooperating and asking for help. Handling teasing and bullying. They're often the targets. They're major Asperger kids can be major bully magnets because they don't pick up the cues. Again, they don't hear the sarcasm. They think someone who's smiling is being friendly when really it could be a smile that's devious, and they wouldn't detect that. And so, and then she would teach them, just the basic manners of, again, back and forth conversation, and not just an info dump, of telling somebody all the facts they know about something in particular. So those sorts of things were things she knew that she could help these kids be able to get better at social skills and be more accepted by their peers, and that it would just make things smoother in life for them. And my son is an example of that. He attributes having gone to the Friends Club from 4th grade until he was in 7th or 8th grade, with him then being able to launch out and be more comfortable with other people and have back and forth relationships and conversations. And he's completed college, and he's had his first job a whole year working at a senior residence where he was a lifestyle assistant, and he engaged people in activities, and it was a very communicative kind of job, which would have surprised me years ago, but he's been able to make those kinds of strides. So it's, again, autism impacts people at all different levels, and this is for the higher functioning people, which is where the Asperger syndrome is. That's what that's called. And it came from Hans Asperger, who was an Austrian doctor who he was a pediatrician, and he kind of noticed that there were these few kids, mostly boys, who were just very factual based, and he called them the little professors because they loved older people, who thought more on their intellectual level, or they get along with younger people, but not really their peers because they just didn't understand them. And he identified it as something unique, and then it was later that autism was also identified, and then it all kind of gotten forgot because of World War II. And then Lorna Wing, I believe, is the woman, the British doctor in London, who brought the whole thing out and called it Asperger's syndrome after Hans Asperger because she rediscovered his paper.
You used a couple terms that I just want to make sure our listeners catch. One was neurotypical. So that's when we're talking about people who aren't struggling, who aren't on the spectrum at all. Is that correct?
The spectrum.
Okay.
That's the term that's come up, correct. It's just tippies or neurotypicals are people who are not on the spectrum. And then Asperger's syndrome, the nickname has become Aspies, so.
And that's not derogatory at all? We can call them Aspies, or they just call themselves Aspies, or how?
They call them, well, when we were writing the book, we made sure that they were calling themselves that online, in cyberspace, because much of Silicon Valley is very Asperger's. The computer and the coding, the technical fields. I've been told that 70% of the Salk Institute, 70 to 80% are Asperger's. Very many of the technical fields attract those on the spectrum because they're concrete sorts of subjects areas, such as science and math and pilots, even medicine, things that are very concrete, where they're fact-based. Historians, that can attract the Asperger's type of mind, because that appeals to their strengths, to their interests.
Okay. As long as we're using those terms in a respectful way, those are helpful to know. The subtitle of your book, Practical Tips to Help Your Child with Asperger's Syndrome Be More Socially Accepted, obviously explains that socialization is a hurdle. Is that the main hurdle then for Asperger's kids or people?
Very much so. Very much so, and it's as simple as the fact of eye contact, for instance. The way we structured our book was that we felt no one has time to read a whole book anymore, or at least they don't think they can, and so we have 85 standalone chapters that sort of call out, that address the typical things that trip up Asperger's kids, and teens, and it is directed though to the parents, the grandparents, the caregivers, the people that are helping sort of get them through. As my son's doctor, the pediatrician who diagnosed him, she said we just need to get them through childhood, because kids can be really harsh, of course, as we know, and there is bullying that goes on, and the kids on the spectrum are especially vulnerable to bullying because they don't see the cues, and they can't read the social cues, and they often are the loners. They're so the one thing that most Asperger's people, according again to Tony Atwood and to Temple Grandin, those on the spectrum, they're very sensitive to sensory stimulation. Things can be too loud, too bright, too scratchy. They hate we usually have to cut out the tags in their T-shirts, or certain socks will bother them, certain material. Something tastes terrible to them. They have ultra sensitivities when they're young, which the good news is they do seem to outgrow some of them, which is great. My younger son hated going to the beach, and we're beach people. And I thought, oh no, this is going to be terrible. And he would go to the beach and he'd immediately cover himself with a towel and just lie there until we left. And the rest of us are frolicking on the sand and in the waves and enjoying things, and he would just retreat. And then later, by about 9 or 10 years old, he was jumping in the waves with us, and he was riding boogie boards. But it was a matter of sensitivities, but he couldn't tell me, and I didn't know. This is the book. Our Quirky Yes, Hopeless No book is the book I wished I'd had when Ben was diagnosed. And then as we tried to muddle our way through his childhood and teenage years. That's why I felt so strongly about writing it with her. That's why I felt so strongly. Also, I thought we were offering such helpful stuff to parents, and grandparents who don't know how to handle these unconventional, quirky kids. And you just want to make life easier for them, and you feel so badly if they seem bombarded by sound and sight, once you realize they're sensitive to it, and then you want to help them. But I didn't know how, and we kind of had to find out, muddle through. And the Friends Club, fortunately, was trying all of these different things with them to help them not desensitize, but help them be able to sort through life and realize how they could be more cooperative. The Friends Club taught them how to be less rigid and less fixed in their positions and in their mindset, which can also be a friendship buster. It taught them how to learn other people's names. They're terrible at remembering names because they don't really distinguish faces, you see, because they're not looking at them. so and also just part of their brain that would remember details, not just names, but also directions, also what time of day it is, what day it is in them, what month it is. Those sorts of things are in the executive part of our brain, the frontal lobe, and theirs is just wired differently, where they have to struggle more to get those kinds of details down, the executive functions. And so it's that sort of thing that she kept working with them at the Friends Club, and of course we work with them at home, on a 24-hour basis, and all of that helps them then by the time they're teens and then going into college, to blend better, to find their way better, and to be able to function better. And now we're working on a sequel to Quirky Yes, Hopeless No, because this was aimed at kids basically from birth to teenage years. And now people like Ben, my son, and Cynthia Norall's former friends who have graduated from all of that are in the workforce. And so we're addressing that. And we have a new book we're working on called Quirky at Work, tapping the hidden value of employees with Asperger's syndrome. Because what we're finding out is even if they get the college degrees, even if they prove themselves to be very smart, very capable, they're not getting along with others at work, or their coworkers don't understand them, and their managers and supervisors can get frustrated because they just want them to be able to be like everyone else. Well, they're not, but they do have wonderful things to offer, and that creative, out-of-the-box thinking that most organizations and especially businesses claim they want. They want creative thinking, and yet that comes with these employees with Asperger's with a few other things that are, not typical and maybe a little different for their coworkers to cope with, but it's not deal breaking. And so we feel that because when Quirky Yes, Hopeless No came out, 1 in 150 children were being diagnosed on the spectrum with autism. And now we're finding out 8 years later that we're working on our next book that it's 1 in 65 are being diagnosed on the spectrum.
That is a
autism.
huge shift.
Well, and not only that, but the millennials are the second largest population bulge to come through our society after the baby boomers. And so we've seen figures of the Census Bureau. It's 85 million millennials are coming into the workforce, which means that we feel, that businesses and organizations need to be able to accommodate and forgive some of the quirks, that may be not typical in a social setting, but that can be dealt with, and that if there's more understanding, if there's more, again, consideration, and there's more questioning, ask, why are they doing such and such? And then they explain it, they usually have a different perspective. But if you're very rational and you explain why you need them to do it this way, a different way, then as long as it's logical and you're reasonable when you're saying it and emotions are not involved, then there's usually compliance. And they're rule followers in general. They like rules. They like things that are set and don't change very much. And so this is helpful to them.
I want to go back to the way you structured the book, because obviously you put a lot of thought into it, first by front loading it with a description of what an Asperger's child would look like. But each chapter, as you said, these standalone chapters they're not only very specific, each one has references to other chapters. For example, your bluntness and unintentional insults chapter at the very top references apologize. Right. Your other chapters on apologizing, conversation, empathy, manners, rudeness, and white lies, and sparing other feelings. So that's a lot to cover, and it's a lot of help. So let's get into these quirks. So beginning with bluntness and unintentional insults, either specifically or broadly using these tips and advice from other sections or chapters, tell us how to deal with that.
Well, that's what each chapter strove for. So as we were writing this, that we had these set aside. I call it the issue du jour. In other words, the challenge of the day. Are these various things, and you never know which challenge will present itself. The catchphrase when you're living with, or you're teaching, or you're working with an Asperger's person is expect the unexpected. That's just what's going to happen. Again, they're hardwired differently. This isn't behavioral. It's not psychological. It's a social and a communication kind of a disability, and they just have a different way of thinking. And with bluntness and intentional insults, the reason there's that box at the top sort of saying what else touches on this is because, again, we weren't blending everything. Each of these chapters stand alone. So we know that people may learn about those are connected kinds of issues that will come up. And so we say different things in the different chapters. For bluntness, for instance, often they don't hear it at all. Someone will ask them, so do you like this dress? And they'll look at them and say, it's hideous. It wouldn't occur to them to lie, because they don't lie well, which is a wonderful trait, I think. But they wouldn't try to make nice because they just don't think about it. They figure the person's asking them, they'll give their opinion. So the niceties of manners and the niceties of sparing someone's feelings just don't really come to kids on the spectrum, especially Asperger's kids, naturally, because they're not very aware of their feelings in general. They are, again, more thinking, more fact-based by wiring, by birth. And so what they do need to be part of the training at the Friends Club and in the book is to help them be aware not only more of other people's feelings so that you're not insulting them accidentally or you're not being rude, but also to be more aware of their own feelings, which they don't come by naturally. We have an emotions chapter, in fact, which I think is great, because there's a part where it says, because they don't look at the face, they zero in on the mouth, because that's where the words come from. So if they look at the face, that's what they'll see. They miss a lot of the clues. And it's saying in here, in fact, they are very unaware of feelings, period, in their own and others. Being concrete thinkers, facts and thoughts rule, while feelings are unfathomable. And again, they're not unfathomable for life, but it just takes training. It takes working at it, and it takes teaching them, and then they get it, and then it can help. But the bluntness and unintentional insults is just the foot and mouth disease that we also would, the rest of us would sort of say, okay, I've done that. Oops, said the wrong thing. And when they speak, they're not aware of how harsh it sounds. They're not aware of, of the fact that, again, things need to be kind of softened up. So we give them examples. Again, each chapter, what we try to do is sort of set up what the Asperger's kid does, or what the neurotypical does, and then what the Asperger's kid does. We flip it around, and then what Cynthia would do at the Friends Club, what her workers, her leaders, her group leaders would do with the kids at the Friends Club to practice softening that bluntness, to practice checking yourself, and before you say something, think, ooh, should I really say that, or could it hurt someone's feelings? Is what's great. We say, one of our longtime friends once confessed to his mother when he was 15, I have a knack for saying the absolute worst thing at the worst possible time. Well, that particular friend was my son, Ben. And he would say these wonderful things that made their way into the book, because this is what you get, at 8 in the morning or after school, that Cynthia wouldn't have heard, but I heard. So that's what made this book more real, because it's both at school and in the institutional environments, but it's also at home, and what happens with friends and family at home. So what we have a number of strategies, because they have that knack. For instance, we work on them, trying to have a type of gatekeeper in their brain, that just kind of makes them test it. Is that too truthful? Another strategy they'd have is that they would compare their unintentional insults to a pebble sort of thrown into a pond. So in other words, just when they say that one thing, well, that they would think, oh, that's just one thing. No, it ripples out, and so it can affect how the person feels about them, about other things, and other people can be offended. So you just have to stop and think, should you say it? And the other is the person's reaction. For instance, parents, guiding them is to not get mad at them. So they've said something rude or harsh or whatever. Don't get mad at them and yell at them, or get mad at them and just be exasperated, because emotions very much tend to they're very sensitive to other people's emotions, even if they're not to their own, and so that can make them kind of shut down, and they won't hear you. And this has been proven in experiments that have been done with Eric Courchain, a professor at UCSD, who's been studying autism for a very long time, and they almost get an amnesia of social situations that are too hyped up, too intense for them. They just have this light switch sort of in their brain that shuts down, so that they kind of remove themselves mentally from the situation, because it's just too intense an experience. And so the best way to handle anything with anyone who has autism is to stay calm, to stay rational, and to use logic, and to not trigger that over intensity of sensitivity for them, and to just ask them why they would say something like that, or could they say that another way, because that would hurt someone's feelings, and to just allow them then to say, you could apologize. And that doesn't come naturally, unfortunately, either, apologizing for something, because they often don't think they're wrong. And so it's important in the social arena, though they can be often wrong, and so it's important for them to learn how to say I'm sorry, and to say, please forgive me. What I meant was, and so that's what each chapter tries to do, is to give the caregiver, to give the parent, again, the teacher, the coach, a way to approach the child and have them be able to be part of a group and be accepted by the group, but learn these niceties that would help them.
One of them, I really like the concrete visual you give them of the pebble. I can see why that would work for them. But one of the characteristics of these kids is that they don't like to look people in the eye. You say that it's either too distracting or too stressful for them to
Yes.
look people in the eyes. And so you give us a chapter called Looking Like You're Paying Attention. So maybe you can explain
Yes.
what you teach them to look like they're paying attention.
Well, and then I even had tagged the eye contact one chapter, just because it is so fundamental to social interaction. And that's it. People get offended if you don't look them in the eye. They think you're not listening. They think you don't care. Our eyes really are the windows to our soul, and that's how people usually read each other, is through the eyes. And so it's disconcerting to people. It was disconcerting, for instance, to my son's boss. At his job that he had, because you'd call him in to address something that had happened. It wasn't huge, but it was just something that that she felt she'd heard someone criticize him, some criticism about it. So she called him to talk to him about it, and he would keep looking away when she was talking to him. And he said, I was listening to her, I heard everything. He said, but I was sort of ashamed, and also I just couldn't look her in the eyes. It's too confusing, and I wouldn't hear what she had to say. But her boss took it that he wasn't paying attention, he was being disrespectful, and that this wasn't acceptable, sort of. And that's what's so difficult for them, is this eye contact thing. And what's interesting at the end of the eye contact, you asked about specific strategies, and in the eye contact thing, there is an actual. Again, Tony Atwood tells his clients, his people that he sees, to tell people, I need to look away to help me concentrate on answering your question. And that really is the essence of what it is, and at least you're giving them an explanation for not making that eye contact. What Cynthia went on to then sort of perfect, was this other technique of, yes, act like you're listening, look like you're paying attention, just because then it doesn't distract the teacher or the employee or employer, and it doesn't, though they will think, if you're looking like you're paying attention, you want to look in the general direction of the person speaking. That's the key thing. If you can look over their shoulder, if you can look off to the side, if you can even look down, towards their legs or up above their head, then that looks like you're paying attention. Just look in the general direction. Another technique, though, that she offers up in looking like you're paying attention is the hit and run, where the person with Asperger's looks at the individual briefly in the eye and then looks away, slightly off to the side, and then looks at them in the eye again while they're talking and looks off to the side. That can work for some people because it's the glance, and that works. And then also, as she said in the eye contact chapter, though, too, that some of her clients, some of the kids had said that they can look at someone who's talking to them out of the corner of their eye, and then it's okay. Well, then what she wanted them to do was then just shift their gaze then so it's out of the corner of their eye, but try to get their gaze at least close to the person. And again, that looks like you're paying attention. And it just helps the whole communication go more smoothly, because it will look more two-way instead of just the person feeling like they're talking to a wall or they're talking to someone who's not listening to them, which only frustrates the neurotypical person.
Really important. I mean, they are going to be working with people one way or another. So those are really important skills. I wish we had time to talk about so many more of these chapters. It's really comprehensive, and I know that our listeners will benefit from reading it. But I'm just wondering, is there a particular chapter that you find yourself pointing people to often that you feel is really essential?
There are a couple of them, actually. And it's one of the bullying, absolutely. In fact, bullying, again, that's what Cynthia felt. Dr. Norall told me, and I think we said it in the book, that the majority of her clients were referred to her because of bullying at school. for these poor kids, and they just didn't have the coping skills, and no one knew quite how to help them, and arm themselves, essentially, just being able to have a basic knowledge of how to handle bullying. And so that we spilled over on that one. We had the bullying chapter in the front, so it's with all the alphabetical chapters, but then we also have one at the back section, because there was more to be able to tell people that we felt was important, especially about the fact that there are 8 to 15% of kids are bullies, say, in a given school. This is from some research that was done in Canada, a Canadian study, and about 8 to 10% of children are repeat targets for bullying, and a higher percentage of those are those on the spectrum, especially, for instance, with Asperger's. And what's interesting, though, is 70 to 80% of students are a social majority. They're called a social majority, and they're the ones that are neither bullies nor targets. They're just there, but often they kind of ignore what's going on because they don't notice it, or they don't want to get sucked into it, or they're afraid, and they're just kind of on the edges. And some may even egg on the bullies. But what the study found was that as long as just one person, just one of that 70 to 80% stepped in and said, come on, you don't need to do that. Or told the kid who's being bullied, here, let's go over here, and I want to show you something. Anything to break the dynamic, that was huge. And it could stop it all from happening. To me, that's an important. Those two chapters are extremely important to address. Another one, you asked about a particular chapter, and I have to say that meltdowns is one of my favorite, because it was the last chapter, Janet. We'd already gone through 5 drafts of this, 4 drafts at least, and my son Ben came home from high school, and he had a meltdown, and he hadn't had one in months, even years. And he had a meltdown, which is unlike any tantrum a younger child has. It can be rather volcanic. It strikes out of nowhere, as I say in the book. It's like an earthquake. It just hits fiercely and without warning, and it just kind of shakes everything up, because they're just so miserable. And he could, Benji could just lose it completely. He'd cry. He could pull on his hair. He'd want to throw something. He wouldn't, but he'd want to. You could just tell it's all this pent-up anger and frustration, and there can be sobbing and shouting. And so what I realized after he'd done this over a photography class that was unsupervised, so that made him, all the more aware of his communication inabilities, and so he just came home frustrated. So I sent him off to his room, and he just goes and listens to his own music, and he even goes and plays Legos. They're a wonderful, soothing therapy for a lot of these kids, and just get lost in Legoland in his room. But I realized downstairs, I looked around, we didn't have a meltdowns chapter. We had everything else. If you look at the box at the top, it has anger, anxiety, depression. It has points of view, self-regulation, but there wasn't a meltdowns chapter. And this is one of fortunately, they outgrow it. I have to say, knock on wood, Ben hasn't had one in years now. He didn't have one in college. But up through high school, it was still an issue. And so it was an important chapter, just because it gives, again, specific strategies of how to cope with it, because it just blindsides the individual who has the meltdown, and it blindsides the family or teacher or whomever who has to cope with it. So those two definitely, and then, again, the sensory sensitivities chapter also is important, because that's so fundamental to them. And I think I started saying that Tony Atwood and Temple Grandin, again, they most people who have Asperger's actually love their special interests. They enjoy the way they think. They don't have a problem with having it. But the one thing that they do wish they could change is that they wish they could reduce that sensitivity to sensory stimulus. They wish that they could not be so sensitive to loud noises and to odd smells and to things that bother them by tactily, all the senses, or taste, that they many of them will only eat certain foods, and that's part of their sensory sensitivity. Again, fortunately, they can outgrow it, and there are specific strategies in this chapter to help them cope with it, because it's more of a coping when they're younger. You can't have them outgrow certain things. You can't speed that up, but you can at least introduce other sort of like tastes to them, or more gentle tastes that get them out of their habit of only eating certain foods. And you can buy softer clothes, so that they don't bother them so much, but then start introducing them to, what other kids are wearing. those kinds of strategies. It just helps.
So many good ideas. I'm sure it's going to be a great read for our listeners. I just want to talk about the parent's point of view. You mentioned this last section of the book, which I thought was really rich. One of the things you include in there is a sample email from parent to teacher at the beginning of the school year. And
Yes.
you shared one that you drafted for Ben.
Yes.
You name the syndrome and you give a detailed explanation about medications and dosages. What else should a parent include in that kind of a letter?
Well, this was geared more to when I got this tip from an ADHD session that I had gone to, a presentation by a pediatrician who specialized in ADHD, and it was another parent. And this is important for parents to know as well, who may have children on the spectrum who's listening to this, that reach out to those other parents. I'm sure you already have. We all learn from each other. It definitely takes a village when you have someone on the spectrum in the household. You need to learn from anyone and from everyone, and share what has worked for you, because it's all a learning experience. But they had told me that Ben was about to go into junior high school, and it's different in elementary school because you can actually talk to the teacher, right after school. It's just one teacher. You can find out how they do. I used to do that every day. I would go pick Ben up at the elementary school and then ask the teacher how it was going, and then we could adjust day to day, and it made it easy. But in junior high and high school, or middle school as they call it now in high school, you're separated from all those teachers, and they don't want parental involvement or interference in the classroom, and that's understandable. And so one of the parents told me that you don't count on the IEP, the individual educational plan, to have reached the teacher right away in the school. They found out sometimes they didn't get it until late in the first month. And so what they did was that they would send an email telling the teacher, about their child and all of that. And I decided it was best to let Ben be in the class for a week, see how the first week went, and then at the end of the week have that positive spin of, hey, it's been a great first week, because usually it was. Things hadn't kicked in yet. Everybody's getting to know each other, and I still figured they probably would have noticed a few things by then. So it was important to step up and just go ahead and you write to them and let them know the things that they may not see if they haven't gotten that IEP yet, if they haven't been notified through the proper regular channels about your students' issues and about certain things that help them within the classroom. And so I just made up letters all through his high school years. That would be every time he had a change of teachers, change of semesters, whatever. Then I would write a letter to each of his teachers to let them know up front, so that there would be no misunderstandings, and each one of them invariably would email me back immediately and say, "Oh, thank you so much. And yes, Ben is a very interested student. I appreciate that, but I was wondering about this, and so I appreciate your telling me." And to a teacher, they were very grateful for being notified in that simple way. And then, as you noticed at the end of the email, I say, I'm available, and I work with him after school. We do our own study hall, because I found that helped Ben most. He also has ADHD, not the inattentive type, thank goodness, not the impulsive type. So the inattentive type meant that he wasn't a problem in the classroom of being too restless, but he could drift off, and he could be dreamy. And so even though he was on medicine, that would wear off after school. And so we would do study hall at home at the dining table, and he'd sit on one side and I would sit on the other. And I talk about that in the homework chapter. I address that, and that it works perfectly for us, because as a writer, I could do my research and writing, he could do his studying, and it would just keep him on track. If I didn't hear his pencil, I'd say, Ben, how's it going? Ben, what number are you on? Whatever. And so we'd get through that way. So they knew I was an involved parent, and so they had that number if they wanted to ask me, and they usually said I could contact them. So it's those sorts of things that again, the practical of being with Ben and working with him, I would slip those into lots of different chapters. For instance, the courtesy chapter, when he insulted a girl in junior high school, and anyway, a case of him being too blunt when he had called them stupid, she and her friend, and then he was standing there when I'd heard this in the library where I was volunteering at his junior high school. And this is in the rudeness chapter, which is one of my favorite chapters also, by the way. I love the rudeness chapter because it's got just humor out of honesty, which is where the best humor comes from. And right there, the opening of it is this scenario of when he was called on the carpet by this girl saying, "Oh yeah, I know you. You called me stupid," and I said, "Oh no, well I'm sure he apologized," and she said, "No," and then I said, "You need to say you're sorry," and he just looked at me in front of her in the beginning of school. It hadn't started yet, and he goes, "Well, they were stupid," and I just said, "Ben, just say you're sorry," and he said, and he couldn't believe why he'd have to. And so I pulled him aside later and said, "We're going to talk about this." And at home we did, and then I made him, I had to explain it to him why he couldn't say that. They had not known that there were more questions on the back of a piece of paper in class or something. And he thought that made them stupid. And then I let him know that not everybody knows what he knows, and on like that. So the rudeness chapter, the holiday gatherings chapter, birthday parties, homework, it's just, again, the goal was to make it concrete, to have these anecdotes that are true, that came from either the Friends Club or from my own or from what I've heard from other parents their kids have done, and to try to get it in one place so that it could be this handy book, for parents who just feel they're at their wits' end, and are not sure what to do on any given day. We've had parents tell us, in fact, that it's become their Bible. They have it next on their bedside stand next to their bed so that they read it to figure out what happened that day or to prepare themselves for the next day. So that's the highest, I think, form of compliment you can have, is that they felt it had that much value, that they have it right there at hand to be able to consult. Just to let you know, the format came about because I was patterning it after Dr. Spock's wonderful, baby and child guide that he had, that was so many parents' Bibles back in the day in the 50s and 60s, 70s, and it's still popular. But I loved how Dr. Spock's book was, you zeroed in on the particular thing. Bee stings, you go to this page. Tantrums, you go to this page. Again, it wasn't structured. You could just pull out those specific things that counted, and I thought that was a great, handy way for the busy parent or for the overwhelmed parent to be able to just zero in on what it is they need to know at that moment. And that's why it's structured the way it is, and also his conversational tone in the Dr. Spock baby manual was so reassuring if you just read the intro, and so conversational, and felt so one-on-one. That's what we felt this should be as well, is that you're in it together, and here's this advice that has, Dr. Norall has figured out, and then I've pitched in as a parent, and it's that one-on-one, we're in it together here, and let's just be honest with each other, and this is what's going on, and this is how you can help them, and then here's the hopeful end thing. By the way, I would want everyone to go to the wonderful Strengths chapter, where it does talk about the famous people who have, in strengths, and also where successful Aspies is the perfectionism and unrealistic expectations, as well as the Strengths chapter. Both talk about all the famous people who are now, when we look back, knowing what Asperger's is, or an autism, that they're on that spectrum. And it's Sir Isaac Newton, Thomas Edison, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein. Those are just the scientists. But in the musical world, it's Mozart and Beethoven, Erik Satie. In the written world, Hans Christian Andersen, whom I've written a book about, I identified him as not only having ADD but Asperger's because I was living with it with my son. But he's never been completely, officially diagnosed until finally this Irish doctor did. He went back and took what all the symptoms are that we currently recognize as Asperger's, and autism, and then applied them to these quirky, famous people, Lewis Carroll, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle of the Sherlock Holmes, and then also artists. Andy Warhol is very obviously on the spectrum. Michelangelo, though, and Da Vinci, and Vincent van Gogh. It doesn't mean you're not going to be able to do great things. It's just a difference, the disability is communication and social, but that has no bearing on what someone can accomplish and what they can contribute to society. They have some tremendous, wonderful gifts of, again, thinking outside the box, being innovative, being the inventors, being the trailblazers, being our revolutionaries that push society forward. And that's what's huge.
Knowing who those people are and what they've accomplished can be really reassuring to parents and teachers as well as those with Asperger's. Before we go, you've
Abs-
mentioned this Friends Club many times. So tell our listeners if there are Friends Clubs they can already tap into, or if there's a way for them to start their own, or if that's something that uh, they need special permission to start. What do they need to know about that?
Well, the reason I mentioned Friends Club so much is that is what the book was based on. That's what Cynthia had started. Again, her core of what she had written is what I then sort of pulled apart, and then we added a whole lot more to it, and we rearranged it and gave it this spine of just alphabetical, all these chapters. Decoding your Asperger's child is what we call that section, where because she felt that she was often trying to decode the behavior of these children to the parents to have them understand why they do what they do, but she also found herself having to explain to the children with Asperger's and the teens why the neurotypicals, why their parents and friends and the other people were doing what they do, and so she was sort of this in-betweener, this go-between translator, this decoder. So the Friends Club was something that she started, and she's no longer doing it. She's now moved on to something else, and it was not a franchise. It was not something that others can do. But what has stepped up in its place, and I'm sure people will be able to find it in their communities, at their children's schools, are these schools. It's called social circles or social skills training. Cognitive behavior therapists can start these groups. It can be either with a cognitive behavior therapist sometimes, or it can be a school psychologist that starts a social skills group for a different grade levels in their schools. And it's the same kind of idea. They could use Dr. Norall's book to find strategies and find exercises and activities that help kids, for instance, become better team players. Be able to connect with other kids. That's what sort of I think. Those are available, and they're out there. And if they're not, then parents and cognitive behavior therapists can step up, and school psychologists can step up and start them where they think that they're necessary. So at this point, again, ours was unlike other books about autism and Asperger's when it came out in 2009, and it's still in print from St. Martin's Press. And it's won awards. It won the San Diego Book Award for Best in Education, and it also has been the foreign rights have been. It's been printed in Germany. There's a German edition and maybe some others, but it was the first that again had an expert's point of view and a parent's point of view married together. So because of that, it's helpful in that way. It's a more 24/7 kind of view. But that's where I encourage parents and grandparents even or teachers to step up, and if they think that there's enough kids in their group or in their class or in their grade level that they would benefit by being pulled out, or by going to something after school that could just have them sit together, learn from each other, and the revolutionary part. I don't know if I finished that thought. The revolutionary part about what Dr. Norall did is that she had just all Asperger's kids together in a group, because and as one of the kids that came up to her said, "Well, Cynthia, it's about time you had something like this for our species." and they really do think of themselves as a species apart sometimes, and they were more comfortable with their own and it made them feel less self-conscious. She realized, and that this was a bonus. They didn't need a model behavior because that made them more self-conscious and made them feel like failures, more social failures. When they were with each other, yes, they were offending each other. Yes, they were cutting each other off. Yes, they were probably, one was going on and on about, erector sets or, or computer this or that or a video game, but they would forgive each other too because they knew they were probably doing something like that if they thought about it. Mm. And so it ended up that they really learned well by all being of a like kind. Mm. And that they then could be taught, the skills just need to get broken down into very small steps. What we take for granted of just knowing that we look at someone, we say hi, we shake their hand, we ask them how they are, we keep walking, those we all take, most of us, who are born with people's skills just take that in stride. But for someone who has Asperger's, you actually need to break it down into, you walk into a room, if you see you look at someone, they hold their hand out, you hold your hand out, You shake it, not too firm. They would practice shaking in the Friends Club so that they would know how not to be too weak, how not to be too strong. Sometimes they'd shake someone too hard. No, you've got to scale that back, you know. And so it's these small things of social skills that we take for granted that seem like a blink of an eye that actually get broken down into smaller steps in the book and in the Friends Club and in a social skills group at a school or in a community that can help them just learn those basics, which then help them just be able to step into social life more easily and find that one or two friends. And that's all they need is one or two friends, and then they won't be bullied because they aren't by themselves. And they can feel that connection with someone who will have their back, you know, and they can have their back, and they can have that reciprocity that we enjoy. And
Great.
so
well, this really is a Bible,
what
right? This quirky yes, hopeless no. I can see why the second line is hopeless no, because you've given us so much hope. And what a great blend of practical and professional that this combines. When is your Quirky at Work coming out? Do you know yet? We'll look forward to that.
Oh, well, thank you. No, we're just putting the polishing touches on the proposal, and so it will get submitted back to St. Martin's Press, our same publisher, and we hope they'll go for it, because this hasn't reached as many people as I wish. That's why I'm so grateful for you. Thank you for inviting me to do this podcast with you, because Cynthia and I both, once it came out in 2009, especially for 3 years, we were on a mission to try to get it out to as many people as possible, because we just want these kids to be better understood and less disciplined, less harshly punished for things that they have no intention of offending anyone about, and they don't mean to be obstinate or come across as non-compliant or difficult. That's not their intention at all. And if whoever's with them just asks them, now, why are you saying it? Why are you doing this? You will find that the answer is something that you, as a neurotypical, never would have thought of. And so understanding is the underlying key here, and staying calm. And we just have always wanted to reach as many people as we can about the book, just hoping that it would help them be more understanding, be able to stay calmer and get less emotional about it, get less frustrated, and be more helpful and able to bring these kids up to, again, to college age, so where they can revel in information, and they can find their way in the work field as well. And that's what we're working on. Our new book, as I say, we haven't sold it yet. We haven't even sent it to the publisher yet. We want to make sure it's what it should be, and that it's aimed at the right targets, which we think are the managers and the employers, and try to help them understand their workers, so everyone is less frustrated on the job, and so that these millennials with Asperger's will be able to thrive in a work environment and keep their jobs without, and others will be more accommodating for the small quirks that they have, so that the things that aren't expected that they do, well, is it really a deal breaker? Can't we work around this? And let's appreciate the person for what they bring to the team and the incredible insights and the outward looking and revolutionary kind of thinking, and the innovative approach that they look at problems, and they love to solve problems. So can't that be embraced?
Let's just quote. I just want to close with this quote, because I think it does give tremendous hope. You say in the book, the good news is that these kids can become more socially aware, and these skills can be taught. With specific guidance and coaching, they can learn people skills. So therein lies the hope, as far as I can tell. And we are so appreciative of the time you and Dr. Norall put into writing the book, and we appreciate your time today, Beth. Thank you for joining us on the program.
Thank you very much.
You've been listening to Beth Brust, author of Quirky Yes, Hopeless No, Practical Tips to help your child with Asperger's syndrome be more socially accepted. You can find a link to her book on our website, nonfictionforlife.com, and also in the show notes. Again, we thank you for listening to our podcast and for sharing it with others. We thank you for the reviews that you've been giving us, and we hope that we're helping you by curating books that are insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. I'm your host, Janet Perry, and this is the Nonfiction for Life podcast. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.